Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here today. I wanted to let you know that Elizabeth can't be with us today because she is still in the process of moving, and Sharon has school obligations today as she finishes her degree. And Susan Clark, Susan Clark's father died this past week, so she's involved with memorial preparations with her family today. So we send them all our best. So last week we embarked on kind of an ambitious project of talking about the Eightfold path. And we discussed right view. And the Eightfold path, as we discussed last week, can sort of be divided into three parts. There's the so-called wisdom part, right view and right intention, and then the so-called morality part, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and the meditation or reflection part, which is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So it can be viewed as having a vision and then acting in the world and then reflecting on that. And we talked about it being a circular process, not just a path from A to B. So today we'll just spend a few minutes talking about the second element of the Eightfold Path, which is right intention or right resolve, right resolution. Which is a logical next step. If you form a vision, have a view of things, and try your best to make it a view that leads to well-being and benefit for yourself and others. But then it's necessary to act in the world. Right intention, or just intention, forms the connection between those two, between one's vision and one's action. And a fundamental underpinning of all of Buddha's teaching is the insistence that our intentional actions have consequences. And actions that are well thought out, or that are our intentions that are well thought out, are more likely to lead to good consequences. So the first verses in the Dhammapada, which is sort of a little listing of aphorisms of the Buddha in verse form. It goes like this: mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, suffering follows, as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox pulling a cart. Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a peaceful mind, happiness follows as surely as one's shadow. So that makes sense. But we all know it perhaps is not quite that straightforward. That sometimes there is a discordance, a seeming discordance between one's intentions and the consequences that follow. That with the best of intentions, sometimes unhappiness, difficulty, even tragedy can follow. So I think a sort of a footnote to that would be the comment that overall, in the long run, good intentions followed by good consequences. Early in my career, I performed gynecologic surgery. I haven't done that in many years, but any surgeon will, well, one aphorism is that the only way to avoid complications is not to operate. So even with the best of intentions and thoughtfulness, preparation, sometimes there are complications that lead to potentially devastating results. Someone comes in for a hysterectomy and has a pulmonary embolus and dies a week later. So these things can happen despite best intentions. And then there's the issue of the depth of one's intentions. Karma is often defined as intentional action. So that actions that are not intended don't have the same karmic consequences. But there are sort of levels of intention, I think. For instance, you're driving down the road and you hit a pedestrian. Well, there are all kinds of scenarios there. You could have been aiming for the pedestrian, and that would certainly be intentional action, which would no doubt lead to ill consequences. But let's say you're driving down the road and you're just going a little bit above the speed limit. You're in a hurry to get someplace. And you reach down to adjust your air conditioner. And somebody happens to be walking across the road and you hit that person during that moment of inattention. Well, you certainly didn't intend to hit that pedestrian, but it happened. And there will be ill consequences as a result. But one must raise the question of, well, whether you were really perhaps being a little heedless in the way you were driving down the road. Another scenario would be if you're responding to a text on your phone and you hit a pedestrian. A whole other level of heedlessness. So there are, I think, levels of intentionality. And the Buddha invited us to think about this, to reflect on this, to, again, view intention, action, and reflection as an ongoing loop, as an ongoing process. So that before performing an action, you think about whether it is likely to lead to well-being and happiness, whether it's a wholesome action. And then as you're performing the action, notice what's happening. And then after the action is over, reflect on, well, what happened? What were my intentions? Was I taking enough into account? Did I have mixed intentions? The Buddha invited us into this process so that in a sense we're all investigators in our lives. So the right intention, how did the Buddha define right intention? One thing about the Pali scriptures, the early written teachings of the Buddha, is that they're very analytical. It's almost like a math textbook, a geometry textbook, where everything's defined. So, of course, there was a definition for right intention or right resolve or right resolution. So, what was that? What is right resolve? Being resolved on renunciation, on freedom from ill will, on harmlessness. This is called right resolve. Being resolved on renunciation. We'll come back to that in a minute. On freedom from ill will and on harmlessness, those three things. Well, the freedom from ill will, in other words, not wishing sort of evil things to happen to your enemies, is a concept that is shared by most, if not all, major religious traditions. To love your neighbor, to love your enemy. So that when you're angry with someone, instead of seeking out the harboring of ill will and trying to do them as much harm as possible, you try to find a place in your heart for compassion, to in some way come to the point of wishing that they be safe, at peace, and liberated from whatever it is that's bothering them, that's perhaps causing unskillful actions. freedom from ill will. And then harmlessness. The Pali word abhimsa, or the Sanskrit word ahimsa, has a rich history. The word that the Buddha chose was also used in Hindu traditions and in Jainism, traditions that were extant at the time of the Buddha. Wasn't a new concept. But it's a concept that's been carried all the way through the ages. Mahatma Gandhi used the word ahimsa, which was translated into English, nonviolence. And Reverend Martin Luther King picked up on that and applied the same principle to his movement of civil rights. And those who were protesting the Vietnam War picked up on that and used the same principle, by and large, in those protests. And this is carried on through the suffragette movement and into the current time in the Black Lives Matter movement. Ahimsa, harmlessness. Not harming things, not harming other beings. This is called right resolve. So those are the last two, but how about this renunciation? That sounds kind of draconian, especially when you ask the question, well, renunciation of what? And in the Pali Canon, in the teachings of the Buddha, renunciation of what refers to renouncing sensual pleasure. Well, that doesn't sound like much fun. Renouncing sensual pleasure. But I think there's subtlety and interpretation there that's very important, critically important. It is true that the Buddha's followers were encouraged to practice rather strict renunciation of sensual pleasures. So, for instance, they were celibate. They did not eat after noon time every day. They slept on the ground on a thin mat. So they didn't want to sleep in any comfortable bed. And they had a number of other rules that were along the same lines. But the Buddha recognized that that was not suitable for everybody. And not everyone should be a monastic. And in fact, if everyone were a monastic, the monastics would be in trouble because the lay population, in large measure, supports the monastics. So for lay individuals, differences apply. The way I think about it, though, is that the Buddha wasn't concerned that one not experience any sensual pleasure. That wasn't the point. Nothing inherently wrong with sensual pleasure. But the Buddha was concerned that much misery seemed to arise with chasing sensual pleasure. That sensual pleasure, sensuality, should be viewed as a gift and not a goal. Yesterday evening, I was walking in the schoolyard out behind our house in the late evening. It had cooled down a bit. It was relatively quiet, relatively few traffic sounds. The only other people in the schoolyard were two people way across the way, young people playing basketball. So there's the sound of the basketball hitting the pavement, which is kind of comforting. And looking up into the western sky, there were some wispy clouds. There was a waxing crescent moon. And listening, there were the last calls of a couple cardinals, the last calls for the day. Sensual pleasure, completely free, unsolicited, available, not harmful. A gift. So I think the Buddha was in favor of happiness. The Buddha was in favor of joy, but cautioned the chasing after pleasure very often, if not always, leads to suffering and distress and remorse. So taking our joy and our pleasure as a gift and not as a goal. I think Zen Master Dogen alludes to this in a verse from the Genjo Koan, when he says, to carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. So I think I'll stop there, and I know last week Becky had some interesting comments, as well as others had interesting comments about intentions, and I would enjoy hearing what anyone has to say, and in particular, if you're relatively new to the group, feel free to tell us more about yourself. And thank you for being here.